Hi, everyone. I have the great pleasure today to introduce Stefanie Stantcheva. Stefanie is professor of economics at Harvard University, and her research interests are mostly in public economics. So she has worked on issues such as optimal taxation and its implication for human capital accumulation, innovation, inequality. And recently, Stefanie has produced several very important works linking taxation with international migration and investigating the impact of taxation on mobility of people in general, mobility of inventors in particular, but also investigating the relationships between immigration, diversity, and redistribution. So she has published in the very best journals, AER, JPE, Restart, and many others. So Stefanie, I thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And your paper today will be on immigration and redistribution. So the floor is yours for 45 minutes, and then we'll have the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to present in front of such an expert group this project about immigration and redistribution, which is joined with my colleague Alberto Alesina, who needs no introduction, who sadly passed away this year. So we're all very much still under shock and in grief. And our great student, Armando Miano, from the Harvard Econ department. Some people already noticed the cartoon here, which we had picked jointly based on one of these New Yorker cartoons, which to us who are all immigrants in the US, very much illustrates how you sometimes feel when you're asked where you're coming from. So in this project, we're trying to draw the link between views on immigration and support for redistribution policies. Immigration, as you have noticed, and as many of you have worked on, has been an issue in many recent elections, both in Europe and in the US. And many arguments have centered not just around the possible cultural consequences of immigration, but also on the economic consequences and to what extent immigrants would contribute to public finances or hurt them, and to what extent they may be a detriment or rather an asset for the welfare state. And in this project, what we're trying to address is exactly these questions, which is first, how do people misperceive immigration? I'm already putting the mis in there because it will turn out that there's lots of misperceptions on immigrants. And we're not just interested in what people think about, say, the number of immigrants, although that will be an interesting aspect too, but also about a more detailed composition of immigrants. So what do people think about the number, the origins of immigrants, their religion, their economic characteristics such as unemployment, education, etc. And then we're interested in how the link between immigration and redistribution policies is formed. So of course in a correlational sense, but also in a causal sense. And there's many theories that have been written about the fact that generosity doesn't travel very well across national, ethnic, or religious lines, and that people in general prefer to redistribute or contribute to redistribution when it benefits others who are more like them or more similar to them. And so we are interested in seeing how this is across countries in a correlational sense, but then also whether we can actually shift people's views and then as a consequence shift their views on redistribution. And so what we will apply here before I continue, I want to give you a one-page summary of the major methods we've been using and that we've been trying to develop over the years. And I think many people in the audience have also been developing and building these methods. So these are large-scale socioeconomics surveys and experiments. So we call it socioeconomics surveys because it's about how people reason, think, and form views on really economic issues and economic policies, but based on views and considerations that are broader and that are linked to social issues as well in the society that they live in. And a lot of our work as economists clearly is about, the very important questions of how policies are or how they should be based on economic observational data. But we really want to add a third angle to this and also look at policy through the lens of people's eyes and their perceptions and basically their mental models, and doing this with these methods that are surveys and experiments. And I'll tell you a lot more about them as I go through the project. But what's key is that these surveys are really an important tool because there is things which are just invisible in other data, no matter how good it is. And the reason I'm spending some time on this is because as economists, we naturally, and for good reason, often prefer, our observational data and our revealed preference approaches. We may even have some intrinsic mistrust of surveys, especially in light of, for instance, recent election polls, which were, again, quite off. Or if we think of older style surveys, which were used to measure things that today we can see much better in administrative data, in firm data, etc. But these other methods hit their limits when it comes to things like perceptions, attitudes, knowledge, and views. Because in principle, we may write a fully structural, parametric model of these intangibles and then use observational data on a range of behaviors to estimate the underlying unobservables. But this would require not only a lot of structure and quite difficult to justify assumptions, but also a lot of variation that we don't actually have in the data. So we're not asked very often to vote on many separate issues to be able to actually see a real world variation. And even more, a lot of views actually hinge on what we could call higher order beliefs, which is what we think others may do. And these are things that we will never see revealed in our own behavior. So there's an intrinsic limit to our revealed preference based on observational data approaches. And so surveys, in some cases, are a great tool to actually elicit these intangibles. And of course, they have weaknesses like other methods. And it's critical for the results to be reliable, that the surveys are well designed, carefully calibrated, and then run on appropriate samples. And a lot of work goes into the design of these surveys. So I'll walk you through some of the questions in greater detail to actually illustrate that and why it's very important to make them, understandable, interactive, and to control the frames that respondents see. We can, of course, talk much more about this in the Q&A as well, for those of you who are interested. Okay. All right, so in this case, what we're going to do is to run a survey in 6 countries, so France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, the UK, and the US. And we will have in total above 22,500 respondents across these countries. So the survey, I can jump straight into the structure to give you an idea of what's being asked and what's being done. So it will have the following structure. First, we will ask people about their socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. So in addition to the traditional things like age, gender, income, education, etc., we will also ask whether they have an immigrant parent, in detail about their political views, their sector of work, so that we can match it to how immigrant intensive that sector is, etc. And then people will be randomly led into one of 4 branches. The first branch will see information on the actual number of immigrants in their country. The second will see information on the origins of the immigrants in their country. And then the third will receive an anecdote treatment, so not factually based, but rather a story, a narrative about a day in the life of a very hardworking immigrant. And then we will have 2 blocks, the order of which will be randomized. So here, first in the immigration block, or second, depending on which branch you land in, we will ask in detail about your perceptions on the number and characteristics of immigrants, like their origin, their religion, how hard people think they work, their unemployment, poverty, reliance on government transfers, etc. So on many of these, almost all of them, we can actually compare to reality. So one big part of the project was to actually go and construct these real world counterparts of all these perceptions, and exactly in the way that we ask about in the questions. And then on immigration policies, we're going to ask people about support or lack of support for various immigration policies. We're actually trying to be quite detailed. So not only asking, do you support more or less immigration, but also some more nuanced questions, such as, for instance, how long after immigrants arrive should they be eligible to vote? Should they be eligible to apply for citizenship, or be eligible for benefits or transfers from the government, so that people can express a variety of views that could be different on when they want people to, for instance, get citizenship versus get benefits, etc. And we also ask when people would consider immigrants to be truly American or truly part of the other countries, and also whether the government should actually care equally about immigrants and non-immigrants. And then we have the redistribution block, where we ask people about their views on important redistribution policies. So we break this into 3 steps. So first we ask them about how to raise a given tax burden. So we're going to ask them to set income taxes on various groups, but holding the total revenue constant, so that they're not taking a stand on how big the government should be or not. They just need to raise that revenue and split the tax burden. Then we ask them about how to allocate a given budget. So same story, but flip side of this. Now you have this given revenue allocated between major spending categories, such as social insurance programs, health-related programs, defense, infrastructure, etc. And then we even have donation question, which is if you want a sort of private way of redistributing. So in this donation question, we ask people whether they want to spend some money on one of several charities. And the way this is done is actually that when respondents enter the survey, they're informed that they're enrolled in a lottery where they can win $1,000. But before they know whether they have won, they have to commit at various points in the survey to spend part of that money or not. So it's a way to make them play with relatively large amounts before they know whether they've won. And this is binding. We implement whatever they tell us. And so the charities, importantly, are not charities related to immigrants. Remember, we're interested in the link to redistribution overall. And so these will be charities directed at lower income people. So for instance, in the US, it's going to be Feeding America or the Salvation Army. In Germany, it's going to be Caritas, etc. And finally, we asked them also here about some detailed views of the government, such as, what the government can actually do about inequality. Does it have the tools? What should be the scope? What is their trust in government, etc. One thing to note is that obviously we need to put some definition of immigrants, and we need to be precise so that people answer what we want them to answer. So what we repeat multiple times is that the definition of immigrants here is people who are foreign born, so not born in the country. This is to avoid issues related to different rules across countries for citizenship and naturalization. And so if you are a second generation immigrant, according to this definition, you are not an immigrant. So we're really asking about people who are first generation immigrants. And for the US specifically, we also make sure to emphasize that we're asking only about legal immigrants, because illegal immigrants are a larger share than in European countries. But for robustness, we'll basically compare in the appendix all the results, also if we included illegal immigrants, in case people just mix it together. Okay, so to summarize here at the bottom of the page, there will be 3 types of randomized experiments here. The first type, which will turn out to be the most powerful, is actually just this simple priming treatment where we switch the order in which we talk about immigration versus redistribution. And in this case, respondents in the control group that didn't see any of the videos will never have heard the word immigrants if they have to answer the redistribution question first. And so they will just answer those questions without being primed about immigration, and vice versa if they see the immigration questions first. But either way, they will not see any info. They will just be asked questions. And so that serves as a prime. The second type of treatment, an experiment, will be these informational treatments where it's purely about providing facts, say on the number or the origin of immigrants. And then the third type is this anecdote, in this case, on a hardworking immigrant and a day in their life. Okay, if there are no clarifying questions here, I'll actually dig into detail, in a bit more detail into the question design. Okay, all right. So one thing that we need to pay a lot of attention to is to make the questions understandable and clear and interactive. So in general, it is not a great idea to just ask people, give me a percent, or just fill this text entry box. But what's good is to have some visual cues. So for instance here, to elicit the share of immigrants, we have this pie chart plus slider design. So when the respondents land on the page, the pie chart starts completely gray and the slider is at 0. And as they move the slider, the pie chart starts to update in real time. And in red, it indicates what they're answering in terms of who's foreign born, so who's an immigrant in this definition, versus who's not foreign born, that's in blue. So you see that this is actually immediately benchmarked, because whoever is not foreign born here is by construction, foreign, like not foreign born. So when you answer one question, you're answering the other two. So it's naturally benchmarked. In addition, it gives you a visual impression whether your answer makes sense. So while you may not necessarily think that 7% or 8% means a lot, or 30% means something, you can see visually what you're answering here. And so this actually leads to, relatively good questions. Note that since the slider starts at 0, normally you may think that we're actually perhaps anchoring people to a lower number, but exactly the opposite will be the case in the answers. To elicit the perceptions on the origins of immigrants, we have a similar design that's slightly more complicated. So now the pie chart represents 100 immigrants in the country, and respondents have to indicate from which regions these immigrants come from. So this is not shown here, but actually on top of the screen for each respondent, they have a map of the world where the regions are marked in these same colors here, so that there's no ambiguity about which country lies in which region. And then there's a range of other questions about the economic outcomes of immigrants, where again, people answer with sliders. I just don't put them all on the page. I just put some text here, because what I want to show you is that it's very important to benchmark the answers. So when we ask about characteristics of immigrants, for instance, out of 100 legal immigrants, how many are unemployed? We always also ask the same question about non-immigrants, about natives. So that way we have a benchmark so that we can understand, are people just off on issues of unemployment, for instance? And actually it will turn out people are very off in terms of unemployment, because no matter how you try to explain what unemployment means to economists, people tend to conflate out of the labor force and unemployment. And so the numbers are in general very big. So if you only asked about immigrants, you may think, well, people think that immigrants are 30% unemployed. But people also think 20% of non-immigrants are out of work, which is very much in line with, say, labor force participation. So it's very important to benchmark all of these questions against something. And the previous ones, like the origin or the share, they're naturally benchmarked, as I said, because you're always answering one question and its complement at the same time. Okay, so what are some key results? So let's start with the perceived and actual number of immigrants by country. And I'm sure I'm not going to surprise many of you who have shown this in different settings, and this has been, floating around, that people overestimate the share of immigrants. So on this graph, each row is one country, and the x-axis represents the share of immigrants that is actually in each country. That's the blue diamond, or the average perception of respondents from that country. That's the red square. And there's some small confidence intervals around the perception, which are actually quite tight. So perhaps, what could be new here is that even if you have a careful design, you will recover this overinflation of the number of immigrants in people's minds. So you can see that in all countries, respondents really starkly overestimate the share of immigrants. So for instance, in the US, people think a bit more than a third of people are immigrants, when the reality for just legal immigrants is 10%, and it would go up to maybe 14%, including illegals. In Sweden, actually the country which has in reality the highest share of immigrants today, people are also the most accurate. So you may wonder what happens if we added second generation immigrants. So, two things on that. First of all, it's not going to close the gap. So second generation immigrants will increase, of course, the reality, but the gaps are so big that it's not going to close more than half at most of the gap in all the countries. The second thing is that it's interesting if people, some of you may think, okay, so people are clearly maybe mixing in also second generation immigrants in because they consider them as immigrants. That's also somewhat a result, which is, we're asking about first generation immigrants. It could be an honest mistake that you think second generation immigrants are first generation immigrants, or it could be just a value judgment that you will still consider second generation immigrants as immigrants. And in fact, in the question where we ask people, at what point will you consider someone to be part of the country? There are many people who answer never, even their kids. I won't consider them as being part of the country, etc. So there's heterogeneity here, and that's already expressing perhaps some value judgment. You may also wonder which groups are more accurate. So on this next graph—
Sorry, Stefanie,
yes.
One question.
Sure.
So regarding this last issue that you mentioned, when you mentioned at the beginning that that at some point you define what is exactly an immigrant. So
yes,
how do you say that?
Yes, at several points we define as immigrants people who are not born in the country, foreign born. As I mentioned, it's because different countries have different rules for citizenship and naturalization. And so it's simply to circumvent that and be more in line with the definition. So it's foreign born. It's quite simple. Yeah.
And do you think that changing the way you define this could also change these perceptions, or did you play at some point with this?
So it completely changed the perceptions, but this is, I think, what I'm saying here, which is that two things you can do. One is to, also include second generation immigrants in the reality you're computing. So in the blue diamond, and correspondingly for the other graphs. So it won't close the gap here. There will still be an overestimation. In fact, not many countries have third and fourth generation immigrant data, but if you try to do a rough back of the envelope, you would have to go to third or fourth generation to close that gap in terms of how many people have been at some point immigrants. And then my second answer was that despite the definition, it could just be that people, it's not that they don't read the definition. It could be either they're truly just genuinely making a mistake about what's a first, what's a second generation immigrant, and they're answering somewhat on average based on their perception, or they're actually, considering, for me, an immigrant is just a different definition. I consider also second generation to be an immigrant, third or fourth, etc., which is why I was giving the example of the answers to the question, when would you consider someone truly part of the country, where there's a wide heterogeneity. And many people say, I will never consider someone who's foreign born and even their kids being truly part of the country. In the US, we played around with randomizing whether we ask about legal or total immigrants, including illegals, and that didn't make any difference. We were wondering whether people may be somehow, for instance, on the economic characteristics, simply loading a lot on illegal immigrants, but that turned out not to be the case. Okay, so the second part here is to answer, whether there are groups which are more accurate than others. And so the way to read this graph is, now we have pooled all the countries together, but we have split respondents into groups where each of the panels here is splitting them into exhaustive, exclusive groups. So for instance, if you look at the bottom two rows, it's the perceptions of right wing and left wing. And the x-axis now indicates immediately the misperception relative to the reality in the country. So, at the bottom, it's the average misperception of right-wing respondents across all countries versus the average misperception of left-wing respondents. At the top, it's perhaps the hardest to read. It's for people who are working in not high immigration intensive sectors, so sectors that don't employ many immigrants, than people who work in immigration intensive sectors with a college degree and without a college degree, okay, and so on. The others are pretty self-explanatory. So given the x-axis that shows you the misperception, you can see directly that no group is accurate. So no group has a zero misperception. In fact, the minimal misperception is 15 percentage points consistently across all countries. So no group is really accurate, not the college educated, not the higher income, etc. Second, you can see that in the bottom row, the perceived share of immigrants is identical for left and right-wing respondents. So there is no partisan gap in terms of the overinflation of immigrants. However, as we'll see in a second, there will be a quite big gap when it comes to the perceived composition of immigrants. And just as a side note, if you regressed policy views, whether on immigration or on redistribution, on the perceived share of immigrants and perceived characteristics, the perceived share per se is not predictive of your views, which is consistent with it is wrong across most groups, even groups that are traditionally more in favor of immigrants. It's the same for left and right, but it will really be the perceived composition that will matter.
Sorry, Stefanie, quick clarifying question. What is the age threshold to differentiate young and old?
I'm not glad you asked, because I was going to change it by putting actually the threshold. Now I'm forced to tell you who's old. And so in my own defense, I will say that Armando, who's very young, made that cut, and he actually put almost me in the old category as well. I think old is actually here above 40, and I swear we're going to change this. In fact, as you may know, when you work with undergraduate students, I swear that one of them at some point made old above 30, at which point I really put my fist down and said, no, this is not acceptable.
Thanks.
One question on this split. So given the big heterogeneity in terms of where immigrants live, can you check this, whether people who actually live surrounded by many immigrants have better perceptions or perhaps worse perceptions than the people who don't live nearby?
Absolutely. No, this is a great suggestion. So in terms of a bit of story here, so we have the zip code of respondents or equivalent. So we asked them about that. So in many countries, there's actually quite detailed local data. And actually, we also got it from papers written by people in the audience here. And yes, we can correlate perceptions of immigrants with a lot of local characteristics, including, you know, the local actual share of immigrants, sometimes even the share of immigrants from different origins, which exists for countries like the US, other things like the average inequality, the incomes, the share of people unemployed, etc. So we actually had that whole part in, and we liked it, but it was only a correlation. And so we you know, some people, you know, give some backlash against purely correlational results. But I can tell you that people who live in higher immigration areas are actually, in a correlational sense, overestimate the share of immigrants because it is more salient, I guess, to them. However, they don't have necessarily worse views of immigrants. In fact, they're more accurate when it comes to things like, well, how many immigrants are unemployed, how many immigrants are educated, etc. So it may make it more salient, but the exposure also makes you more accurate on the characteristics of immigrants, it seems. Another interesting fact is that people who live in areas where there are more minorities, so people who have been there for, you know, generations and generations, that today are minorities in the countries, they are more accurate on the share of immigrants too. Perhaps because they understand what a minority is versus what an immigrant is, while other people who are less used to seeing minorities and immigrants may conflate some of those. And then, you know, finally, the final thing to say is that if you look at this graph here, maybe that's what triggered your question as well, is people who have an immigrant parent versus not. So this is the middle panel here. You see that people who have an immigrant parent tend to overestimate the share of immigrants more. Again, very much like in this exposure idea, that it's more salient to them that they're immigrants. But the same way that the share of immigrants is not the majorly predictive thing of your views on immigrants or redistribution, those people will also be much more supportive of immigration, and they will actually be more accurate on the economic dimensions of immigrants, on their characteristics, as opposed to people who don't have an immigrant parent. Okay, thank you. All right, and so let me show you some other perceived characteristics now, if we go beyond the share. So one characteristic that is salient in people's minds and that will be quite predictive of their views of both immigration and redistribution policy is their perceived share of Muslim immigrants. So the reason I pick Muslim immigrants is because none of the countries in the sample is a Muslim majority country. So I would be very curious how it looks like in a Muslim majority country. So that's to be explored. And so people here in these non-Muslim majority countries really inflate the share of Muslim immigrants. For instance, in the US, people think a quarter of immigrants is Muslim, when in fact it's 10% or much less the last years. France is an exception, actually, perhaps due to its colonial history, and people are quite accurate on that dimension. In the right panel, again, it's this heterogeneity graph that we saw for the share of immigrants. All I would like you to focus on is the last row, which shows you now that there's a gap between left and right-wing respondents that opens up, and that will only grow once we move to the other characteristics of immigrants. That is now, you know, opening up between the perceived share of Muslim immigrants on the left and on the right. Another interesting question to ask people, and I'm just showing you here a select few of the many graphs in the paper, is to what extent do respondents think that immigrants rely more on government transfers? And so on this graph, you see the share of respondents who think that the average immigrant in their country receives at least twice as many transfers as the average non-immigrant. And we define transfers carefully. So we list the various programs adapted to the country. For instance, in the US, the standard welfare, food stamps, EITC, etc. And in no country is this actually true, that immigrants receive on average twice the amount for natives. And so this is a pure measure of inaccuracy here. And so the share of respondents who think so is actually not very small, except in Germany, where it's relatively low. And here again, that's what I wanted to emphasize most. If you look at the right panel at the bottom row, here there's a big gap opening between left and right-wing respondents. So right-wing respondents basically think much more that immigrants rely on government transfers disproportionately relative to non-immigrants. And we also asked some questions that explicitly try to see whether people have some bias. And so here we tell respondents about two identical men, except that one is an immigrant and the other is not. And they're described in the same family situation, same income, same age, living in the same place. So based on the question, you have no reason to think they're different. And then we asked them whether the non-immigrant, who's called John, and the immigrant, who's called Mohammed, receive the same amount of transfers, more transfers or less transfers, and separate question, pay the same amount of taxes, less taxes, more taxes. And the figure here tells you the share of respondents that says, yes, Mohammed gets more transfers and pays less taxes than John. And recall that there's no reason for you to think so based on the question. And actually, Sweden gets the prize here. Swedish respondents here are accurate. 0% of them say that this is the case. But in countries like Italy or France, around 34%, 35% of respondents think so, systematically, that the immigrant pays less taxes, gets more transfers. And actually, we did randomize the name here. So as soon as you say immigrant, whether you call the immigrant Jack, Felipe, Mohammed, etc., it has an effect. But the biggest effect was with the name Mohammed. Okay, and then finally, remember that I told you it's very important to benchmark things that are not naturally benchmarked, like the other questions here. And so to give you an example, here's the perception on how many immigrants and non-immigrants have a college degree, are highly educated. So of course, adapted to the country, college has different names, different degrees, count as it in different countries. But if you look at the left graph, which is immediately plotting you the misperception now by country, because I'm plotting both for natives in blue and for immigrants in red, the average misperception per country. If you had just looked at immigrants, it would be very hard to draw a conclusion. So in some countries, people, underestimate the share of highly educated immigrants. In others, they're kind of at zero. In Italy, they even overestimate it a little bit. And that may just be because people don't quite understand how many people in general have a college degree. And so once you add the blue diamonds and you see the perception about natives, you see indeed, there's just a level misperception that's there about how many people have a college degree. And what you can see is that systematically in all countries, people, maybe overestimating or underestimating the share of non-immigrants with high education, but they systematically think immigrants are less educated than non-immigrants. So this benchmarking is quite important. In fact, the US is interesting because in the US, the gap is smallest between immigrants and non-immigrants because, no matter what, it is understood that the US attracts actually a lot of high-skilled immigrants, and many people do understand that. And then on the right, you can see for the different groups, the heterogeneity graph based on their misperception about natives in blue and immigrants here in green. And you see everywhere for all groups, people have, think that immigrants have less higher education than natives do. Or the misperception is more negative relative to the reality than their misperception for natives. Okay.
Sorry, Stefanie, just
yes.
A question. Have you managed to avoid confusion about where they got the degree, whether they can, the sort of native discount degrees that are obtained abroad or something like that?
So, we're truly asking based on the country. For instance, in France, it would be having gone to a university to receive a licence or higher, etc. What share of immigrants has received an equivalent to that? So it could be that people just discount foreign degrees entirely, absolutely, in which case, that is already signaling that you do not think these people have the same high education, or it could be that they generally think in their country they didn't reach that equivalent. So it could be either one. And the conclusion is that systematically in all the countries, people tend to think the misperception for immigrants' high education is more negative than that of natives. I think if we had gone about, first, it's impossible to define the degrees for all the countries that immigrants are drawn from, and it's not clear that people would know what those mean beyond their current perception. So that's why we basically define it as the equivalent in the country, which is also how the OECD will actually then provide the data on the education of immigrants. Okay, so to sum up the misperception part, people have quite stark misperceptions on various dimensions. In the paper, you can look at unemployment, poverty. I here showed you reliance on government transfers, education, origin, religion, etc. You may also wonder whether the results are driven by, careless answers. And one way, imperfect way, but one way to go about it is to offer, financial incentives to answer accurately, which we do, again, with relatively large amounts based on, based on people's average incomes. And so it turns out that these don't make any difference. So people are perhaps already responding to the best of their knowledge. And by the way, these are not very easy to find statistics. So we realized, and maybe many of you have realized, that if you try to construct, for instance, what's the education or what are the transfers received by immigrants, a lot of work goes into that. So it's not like these are very salient things that are constantly in people's minds. And then another thing is that, do people actually care? How much do they value accurate information? So based on this lottery design, again, where they have to forfeit part of the lottery price potentially before they know whether they've won, we asked them whether they're willing to pay a randomized prize, $5, $10, $20, etc., to get the accurate answers to all these questions. Again, not easy to find answers if you were just to Google. And what turns out is that if we regress your willingness to pay in the first column, conditional on the price that you're offered to pay, and then all your characteristics, what I want to point you to is the first row, where if you construct the misperception index based on all the questions about knowledge of immigrants, and the misperception index is increasing if you're less accurate, it turns out that those who are least accurate are also less willing to pay for information. So this has been, the case in other settings too. Maybe some of you have seen it as well in your own work, that somewhat the more you know, the more you want to learn, which is perhaps why you know more in the first place. And people who don't know are also less willing to pay for that, conditional on all else, conditional on political affiliation, conditional on income. And there's also a slight actually effect on right-wing respondents, especially actually for the US Republican, to pay less for the info on immigrants. Okay, now let's go to the experimental part, because it would be interesting to know whether any of this is actually, causally related to views on redistribution or immigration. And so first, remember we have these informational treatments. So I'm showing you some screenshots from the videos. So the first treatment tells people what share of people in the country is actually immigrant. And so in the US, for instance, legal immigrants are 10%. And then we benchmark it against other OECD countries to show that their country is somewhere in between, that it's not at an extreme. And then the origin treatment will show people where these immigrants come from. And to make it visual and salient, we use different colors and stick men or stick people that show people what share they're proportional to the true number of immigrants from those countries. And so they give you a visual cue how many people come from each region. And so at the end of the video, after the video has gone through all the regions are ranked this way, one below the other. So you can see, for instance, for the US, the majority comes from Latin America and Asia. Okay. And then the anecdote treatment simply tells people about a day in the life of a very hardworking immigrant, or should I say a very, very, very hardworking immigrant. This is like, every hardworking people's dream here. So it's supposed to be a narrative, a rhetoric, not a fact-based thing. So this immigrant has 2 jobs, takes care of her family, has kids, is very devoted to her kids, and has a dream to one day start a small business and make it in the country where she's living. Okay. And so what happens when we show these informational treatments or this anecdote treatment, or remember the final type of treatment, which is the order treatment, where you have just randomized questions on immigration and redistribution. So what we find is summarized here. So just making people think about immigrants by asking them a detailed range of questions, some of the answers of which we saw in the graphs about immigrants, before asking them questions on policies, makes them less supportive of redistribution. And including actually the private donations to charity. So people are even less willing to give to charity. And remember, the charity is about low-income people. It's to help poor people. It's not directed at immigrants. So this is the sense in which it's about general redistribution being hurt by, talking about immigrants here. And this is consistent, of course, with the very negative baseline views that people have of immigrants. So that just priming them to think about it, makes them less prone to redistribution. Perhaps because they think this will benefit mostly immigrants, or because immigrants in their eyes have less than desirable characteristics. On the other hand, the info treatments that show people the share of immigrants or the origins of immigrants really has no effect. So it does have a first stage effect in the sense that it shifts people's views on how many immigrants there are. So they do believe the info, and it has the impact on where they think immigrants come from. But it doesn't have any effect on their views on redistribution. And this is actually echoing, we couldn't know ex ante, but this actually echoes what we see in the correlations, which is that, just the share or just the region of origin is not that predictive. What's predictive is the perceived kind of economic composition, the perceived religious composition, which is correlated but not one for one with those regions. So a noisy measure of that, and how much you think immigrants benefit or rely on government redistribution. The anecdote works somewhat. So telling this very, kind of extreme story about a hardworking immigrant does generate an emotional response. So people become, more supportive of helping the poor, helping lower income people and redistribution. But that effect, again, will get canceled out. Remember, there's all these layers of randomization. That effect will get canceled out if you get the immigration questions first, before you then get the redistribution questions. So although you saw maybe that video, it made you emotional, once you're made to walk through the questions about immigrant, again, the priming dominates and just cancels out. One thing that's interesting is that the info treatments don't just have no effect on they have no significant effect on redistribution views, but the coefficients are actually negative, although they're not significant, which suggests that just talking about immigrants, even if it's to tell you this is the share of immigrants in your country, it's one piece of info, which is like, a drop in the sea of misperceptions in a sense. And so the priming is still playing a role. I cannot tell you something about immigrants without priming you to think about immigrants. So perhaps what could work is a very comprehensive info treatment where you would tell people the answers to all the range of characteristics of immigrants and see whether that would have an effect. And to conclude, clearly narratives have a strong hold here. And so priming about immigrants has a negative impact on redistribution views, but information per se doesn't do that much. I do want to say, however, that our goal here is to see how people think. It's not, our goal is not to push people in one way or the other. So we're not saying anything about how much immigration there should be or what people should be thinking. Many people could have very, very valid views. It's just about uncovering what's a misperception, which, many people would agree that correcting a misperception is a worthwhile goal. It is not about trying to push people in one direction or the other. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to your comments and discussion now. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thanks a lot, Stefanie. I have written down 2 questions. So then there's Dean. So Johan Mulras, Wagner Oliveira, Dean Young.
Stefanie, thank you. Forgive me if I didn't catch all the details about your the information treatment, but I'm wondering to what extent in general, either in this study or more generally, you think perhaps interventions that provide really tailored feedback, addressing people's specific misperceptions might have promise. I mean, you can imagine, I think a number of us have tried these kind of information interventions before. You provide a general set of information conveyed by a video or something like that. But if we take lessons from, say, the teaching at the right level, research and development, where you sort of really try to target the pedagogy and the information towards people's specific gaps, perhaps that can have more impact. I mean, sort of that certainly has been a revolutionary thing in the educational research area. So I do think there's promise for that. Like, say you might ask a set of questions and then provide tailored feedback about the specific things that people got wrong. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a very interesting question. And I agree with you that sort of progress in the education literature is very informative here. A bit on the point where I ended. So first to clarify, the goal that when we say they hold more promise, what's the goal? I think let's agree that the goal is to fix misperceptions and, give people the information that they need to then make whatever decision they want, right? Whether it's going to turn out that they will want more immigration, less immigration, more support for distribution, etc. So the goal, let's say, is to fix misperceptions. I completely agree that different misperceptions are more salient and of more importance to different people. And so tailoring it would be very, very interesting. In this case, what's interesting is that everyone across all groups, as you saw, has a misperception of the share of immigrants. And so that seemed like a quite natural generalized information that many people wouldn't know. And that, that does close the gap on that aspect, doesn't shift any of the policy views. And so I think it would be very interesting, for instance, for people in different sectors of work that may feel differently exposed to immigration, and that may have different views based on the people they encounter. Yeah, I think tailoring would be very interesting.
Johan, your turn, and then we'll move to Delia and Eli.
Yeah, my question is just, so what do we know about how people form perceptions about economic statistics, right? I mean, so I don't know anything about it, and it's crucial in your work.
So what do people misperceive on economic statistics?
So how do the people make these perceptions, right? Like, do they look around where they live, and that gives them, their perception about the share of immigrants? Perhaps if you live in a rural area, right, you think, oh, well, perhaps there's no immigrants around me, but they're all concentrated in the nearby town. And it must be huge because every time I go there, I see all this diversity, right? This type of thing. So yeah.
Yes. No, I think this is related to the point about, say, local exposure, which I already answered, absolutely. But so we don't really say here what's forming those views. And as probably many of you, one conjecture that we have is that it could be also the media rhetoric that's that's propagated in many countries for good reason, perhaps, in a sense that for anything, not just immigrants, no news is the average thing, and news is what's an outlier, what's not average, what's exceptional. And so in that sense, the media may have a very natural contribution to our views, because we perhaps don't weight accurately, this is news, hence it is an outlier. It's a 1 in 100-year storm. That's why we write about it, not because it's everyday's weather here. So I think that could be definitely contributing. It's tough to identify this. So I know that people have been trying to do work on this, but it's tough to identify the media sources exogenously, because in the end, a lot of it is social media and online, which is actually quite generalized. It's not local anymore, and so it's tough to identify that effect. But if I had one conjecture, probably like many of you, that would be a major driver of what is shaping views on a range of things.
Eli, I think it's exactly the same question that you had. So I suggest we move to Delia, and then Wagner and Chloe. Delia?
Could you tell us how you decided on that particular anecdote? Why did you focus on the hardworking immigrant as opposed to an immigrant who's had bad luck, either in the US or in the home country, or just a story about an immigrant's anything else?
Yeah, no, great question. So I think because of the redistribution aspect, we are very much coming from a perspective of, effort, meritocracy versus bad luck as the distinguishing, as the distinguishing factor on whether you support redistribution or not. Also influenced by Alberto's work, that people tend to think things are the result of your own effort, want less redistribution, as opposed to people who think it's bad luck. So here, in a sense, it's that immigrant is already working very hard, hence their low income, their need for transfers if needed. It's just bad luck in that sense, the residual. So they're already doing the best they can. So in a sense, when you talk about hardworking, you're also taking a stand on what share of it is bad luck or bad circumstances. But I think it would be also very interesting to do another sort of more narrative, emotional story about just, which may take us closer to maybe refugees as well, immigrants, or people who come in very precarious circumstances. One great advantage of these surveys and experiments, as those of you who do them know, you can just rerun something. So you can add videos, you can add questions. So I think that would be very interesting to see whether that would have a different impact.
Wagner?
So Stefanie, thank you very much. I learned a lot from your presentation. My name is Wagner. I'm a PhD candidate in FGV in Brazil. I would like to ask if you could comment on how representative is the sample of respondents. I mean, how do they compare to the local population of the countries that were surveyed, and how did you get to the respondents with the survey? I mean, I just like a clarification on that. Thank you. Great.
No, wonderful question. So these surveys are run through commercial survey companies, which are consumer survey driven normally. So they're contracted by various companies that have goods or services or products that want to inquire about their consumers. And what's good is that they come from a range of incomes because they're rewarded by the survey companies in different ways. So for instance, they're rewarded by frequent flyer miles if they want that, or hotel points or credit card points. So they're not just rewarded by cash, which would be prohibitively expensive for many groups. So as a result of that, you actually can get a quite broad representativeness. So on our end, we impose quotas on age groups, on gender, on broad regions, and on broad income groups. So of course, you never get very high income respondents. You also never get the very, very low income respondents who are not online. But in a very broad range, you can get good representativeness. So if you compare the statistics of the sample to the census stats, by construction, it's representative along those dimensions we enforce, like broad income groups, gender, age, etc. And then on others, like employment status, marital status, education level, which we don't impose, they're very similar too. So it's broadly, it's quite representative.
Chloe?
Yeah, thanks. This is Chloe Easton. I really enjoyed the presentation. I was curious about your thinking, Stefanie, about whether you think that these results are kind of more of a general, like, other than me effect versus an immigrant effect. Like if you did the same experiment on different races or different religions, things like that, would you see similar results? And I wonder that in part because I think about sort of like policy implications of this, getting back to Dean's question at the beginning, and sort of like, what are the right informational treatments that we might give people? So I was curious about that.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And, the theories that have been written are perhaps broader. They're about, just fragmentation, whether it is based on immigration, based on overall ethnic fragmentation, or minorities that in general tend to consider in-group and out-group. And so that redistribution wouldn't function as well with more fragmented societies due to this intrinsic lack of generosity across groups. But I think there's been a lot of work that informs, an answer to this question, not by me or by my co-authors, but there's, for instance, a lot of evidence in the US that racial issues are very interlinked with redistribution, and that for many people, and even like the evolution of political parties, a lot of the considerations that started as, outright racism have then turned into a backlash against redistribution, driven by the notion that it benefits minorities. So clearly clearly that's been worked on by many people, and that's there. For other, in other settings, people have tried to, correlate like presence of minorities, sometimes actually very well instrumented with migration waves earlier in time, or conflicts that have separated countries and territories differently, and also shown that it then leads to quite different redistribution systems, often less generous the more ethnically fragmented it is. So it's probably a much broader phenomenon, which we here more narrowly look at from just immigration and just in those 6 countries.
Thanks.
So we have a question from Giuseppe De Arcangelis. Giuseppe?
Stefanie, thank you. The presentation was very, very interesting. I was very puzzled by the misperception of the young versus the old in the very first graph that you showed. Mm-hmm. So my question is there a significant difference also in the attitude towards redistribution between these 2 groups?
Yeah, there are differences by age. So let's say it depends how you cut it. So if you just look by age without controlling for anything else, there are definitely differences, and they're not systematic across countries, actually. So in general, older people, as here, above 30 or something, as defined by younger people, older people tend to be more on the right politically, and so tend to support less redistribution overall. They also tend to have higher incomes already, right? And so all that drives you towards less redistribution in general. But it's not very systematic across countries. And what's important is that once you control for actual political affiliation and income, the age effect per se is not there. So there's no significant link between age and views on redistribution if you control for income and for political affiliation. And in fact, in many countries, definitely in the US, but also in many European countries, even income is losing its bite. As you may see now by seeing who votes for which parties, even income has lost the predictive power of how much you support redistribution. And sort of political affiliation and a bit more education now tends to dominate whether you support redistribution or not as a predictor.
Yeah, but maybe I would be interested to know whether Generation Z, so the new generation, especially in Europe, there has been a huge difference between people who were in the Erasmus cohort with respect to the others. So your cut on the age, if you can play on the cut on the age, maybe you can have more significant results.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting in its own right. And to just look at, generational support for redistribution, totally different paper, but absolutely interesting in its own right. In a new project, we actually oversample very young people, including actually people aged 13 and above. So to see if their views are already different or changing, etc. And for the US, perhaps a bit sadly, we already see very strong polarization based on your parents, basically political affiliation. So you very much seem to adopt the views on redistribution, on immigration, on race of your parents.
I think we have to stop here, unfortunately. Simone, I see that there are some written questions that arrive on the website, but I guess that you can collect all these questions and send them to Stefanie, right?
Thank you. That's great.
Okay, so Stefanie, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. I think you are the last speaker of the year. So we finished very well with you. Just a few words to say that this webinar series has been launched since April or May. Simone, correct me if I'm wrong, but it has been functioning very, very well under the coordination and leadership of Simone. So we have all to thank Simone for the great job that he did. The webinar series has been a success. We organized 25 sessions, and the program is full until mid-January for the senior seminar. But as you know, we have also a junior seminar, and they organized 20 sessions, and their program is full until March, if I'm not wrong. Huh? Simone, that's true? Okay.
Correct.
So that's really a success. Thanks to you. So thank you all for attending. And I wish everyone a happy and festive holiday season. See you in 2021.
Bye. Thanks for
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.